Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Yoshi Omijere. I'm a Master's of Urban Planning student here at NYU Wagner, and I'm very excited for our conversation tonight with Deborah Archer, who is a professor at NYU Law and the president of the ACLU, and Polly Trottenberg, who is the dean here at NYU Wagner and is a former Deputy Secretary of Transportation at the federal level and former commissioner of the New York City Department of Transportation. I personally find this really interesting conversation given the context of continued calls to, or continued push to expand the Cross Bronx Expressway and the eternal question of the BQE, as well as a new mayor who is interested in addressing issues with the city's bus system. So I'll leave it at that and let Polly and Deborah take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Great to see you all. And I'm going to admit, I am so excited about this conversation. As Yossi mentioned, I'm a long-time transportation practitioner, but have focused perhaps in a hands-on-the-ground way on some of the very issues that Deborah, bringing her legal brilliance and her civil rights approach, I think has created a book which for me has just been so moving and so important and really helped shape some of my thinking on issues that I've been working on for decades. It's given me a fresh way to look at them. We're honored to have you here, Deborah, and I think we would love to just start, and I know you've given these book talks before, but just to hear your story, growing up in Connecticut, the experiences that you and your family had, how it shaped your thinking on some of these issues, and then your journey eventually to wind up working on a project in Syracuse, New York, one that actually I worked on myself in sort of a different angle that helped bring the lens of, I think, the deep civil rights questions around American transportation infrastructure. So welcome.
Well, first, thank you all for coming. I appreciate seeing so many of you here today, and thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. I was saying to Polly that I'm a little nervous about this conversation because she is actually an expert on transportation, and I just pretend to, I'm a civil rights lawyer who has an interest in transportation. So I hope that she will contribute to this conversation as much as I do. So I do talk about my background at the beginning of the book for a variety of reasons. First is I think it's important to understand my perspective and how I come at this work and why I come to this work. And who I am, my background, is very important to how I see the world and how I engage in the world and why I engage in the ways that I do. So I am the first person in my family to graduate from college. I'm a first-generation American citizen, and my parents raised us first in Hartford, Connecticut, which is, and it was then as well, a racially segregated community, predominantly Black and Latino. And I think it's important to tell the story of Hartford because it suffers and fights against all the ways that we divide, all the ways that we create communities of opportunity and communities of inopportunity, the ways that we target and undermine the ability of people in certain communities to live happy, healthy, and choice-filled lives. All the ways we do that were visible in Hartford in the way that we trapped people in that community and then deprived them of what they needed. And so my parents tried their best in this community where we were surrounded by highways that polluted us and major roadways that made it unsafe for us to navigate our own communities, sidewalks that were unsafe to navigate, a public transportation system that wanted to make it as difficult as possible for us to get out of Hartford and access the opportunities in the suburbs. And so transportation was certainly part of the story, but also the traditional ways that we maintain segregation. People didn't want to show them houses when they decided to move out to the suburbs. When we finally were able to move out to the suburbs, we had difficulty getting back to the city, getting back to Hartford to visit family and friends and be with community, because again, public transportation didn't easily connect us. And then we were one of 3 Black families to move into our community. Our neighbors eventually turned to the most traditional tool of segregation, that was violence and intimidation. And so we were often harassed when we were in the park or in our backyard. And one day we woke up to find, and I was 9 or 10 at the time, to find that our house and car had been vandalized and the KKK had been spray painted on our house and our car. And so I think my story helps us understand the ways that people are trapped in place. That we think that, you know, these things, these communities are created naturally, that people are making a 100% choice to stay where they are, despite the challenges of the community they're in. But I wanted to show some of the ways through my own experience that we have created communities like Hartford, Connecticut, and then made it really difficult for people to leave and enjoy their lives and access all the things that living in America promises to us.
So can you tell us about how you got involved in the I-81 project in Syracuse, and then sort of give I think the audience a flavor of how you came to write this incredible book out of that experience.
So a lot of folks don't think that this work is connected to the work of the ACLU, or is really tied to the civil rights work that is at the heart of what I do. I didn't realize it until I started work on that Syracuse issue, and then it showed me how powerful transportation is. I should have known, right, when we think about white supremacy and the power of white supremacy is in so many ways about place. Convincing Black people and other people of color what their place is socially, and then getting them to stay in that place. And what better way to convince people of their place socially than to lock them in their place physically? And limit the places they have access to, where they can go to learn and be with each other, where they can go to work and worship. And that's just one of the very powerful ways that white supremacy perpetuates itself. And transportation infrastructure has been used, transportation in that project from slavery until today. And you also can't think about America's second Reconstruction without thinking about transportation, right? The Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Riders who were protesting, demanding dignity and equity and access to transportation, the folks who marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the folks today who take to the streets. And of course, you all know better than me that transportation infrastructure is the infrastructure of everything that we care about. It is the infrastructure of high quality education, of access to economic opportunity. It's the infrastructure of a vibrant multiracial democracy. And we can't get to any of those things until we tackle transportation infrastructure. But I was late to that knowledge. I was invited by the New York Civil Liberties Union and other community groups in Syracuse to get engaged to help a community that was facing a highway redevelopment project, I-81. I-81, when it was built, destroyed, segregated, isolated. I think at that point it was a Black and Jewish community, and the result had been some of the most deeply racialized poverty in the country. The highway was crumbling and falling in pieces, had outlived its useful life and needed to be rebuilt, and the community was looking for support in making sure that history was known and a part of the conversation, and that civil rights, civil liberties, and racial justice were central to the conversation as we were rebuilding I-81. From that engagement with the community, which was really transformational for me, I came to understand the way that that story repeated basically in every state around the country has a story to tell about a highway that destroyed either a Black community or another community of color. And so I tell in the book of Dividing Lines, I come at this story with an intervention for people to understand how intentional this was and continues to be. The way that we have co-opted transportation infrastructure to continue the work that we have started as a country in Jim Crow, right? The power of racism is also in the way that it adapts and fills the spaces and finds its ways, the holes and crevices that we leave for it, that it takes up new tools to continue its work. And after we saw the successes of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and the fall of some of the traditional tools of segregation, states and communities around the country turned to transportation infrastructure as a more powerful, more durable, more visible tool to continue that work that they had started before the civil rights movement. So you can stop me whenever you want to, but one of the examples I
I don't want to stop you.
Okay, one of the examples I focus on in the book that a lot of people know about are the highways. And I'll start with Brown versus Board of Education, which I hope everyone in this room knows what Brown versus Board of Education is. Supreme Court decision 1954 says that separate educational facilities by race is unconstitutional. And so Brown signaled the fall of segregation in public education, but it also signaled the fall of segregation writ large because it undermined Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision that said separate could be equal. Right, so when the Brown decision came out in 1954, people around the country were up in arms and said that they were going to do everything they could to fight Brown's implementation. And for 2 years, we had what was called massive resistance. People in the country showed all that they were willing to sacrifice to protect segregation, making attendance at school optional, shutting down schools altogether. When they thought that public pools were going to be integrated, shutting down public pools and movie theaters and parks, all in the name of maintaining segregation. So that hit a peak in 1956 when we had something called the Southern Manifesto. Over 100 federal legislators signed this pledge that said that they would use every tool that they had to maintain segregation. And 3 months after those folks signed the Southern Manifesto, they signed the Interstate Highway Act. And rather than build our interstate highway system against the promise of Brown, it was co-opted as this post-Jim Crow tool. And there are stories around the country, and I tell some of them in the book, where we see the way that it was just kind of a one-for-one exchange. So I see you, I'm trying to stop, I see the microphone.
So I'll jump in a bit on, I think, some of what you're talking about in the evolution as I've seen it in the transportation world, which I think is mostly not quite ready to embrace the notion. I saw an interview with someone that said, we all thought the interstate highway system was great. I think it's been a long time since people think that the interstate highway system was universally great. But I think there was a mythology about the history, you know, famously going back to President Eisenhower and a desire to have a country that was connected by highway, that would be prepared for war and commerce and everything else. And, you know, it's interesting, you talk about your childhood and sort of the impact that it eventually had on you as a transportation thinker. I'll talk a little bit about a moment in mine that I think brought me to a positive place on transportation. I actually grew up mostly in Pelham, New York, suburb right north of here. But when I was in high school, we moved, and that's a small town where you kind of relied on your own 2 feet and your bicycle to get around. It was before the age of chauffeuring parenting. And then we moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts when I was in high school, and as high school students, we were given subway passes. And I commuted to high school in Boston, and at that moment, my world exploded. The very things that you didn't have access to, the opportunities, the chances to be part of the cultural life and have friends and so forth in this far from area around Boston was tremendously impactful in my thinking about just the possibilities of transportation. And I'm sure you're familiar, there's been a lot of amazing scholarship, Rob Shetty from Harvard talking about when you look at the many ways that place affects people's social and economic mobility, access to good public transportation is an incredibly important determinant. So for me, that's been sort of a lifelong cause, and it certainly intersects with what we've seen in the interstate era, but I think as you hit in the book and I've seen, but it is deeper than that. It's not only the physical highways that we built and the barriers that they created, but the places we invested and we didn't invest in things as basic as sidewalks or things more robust like good bus systems and subway systems. And so grappling with that legacy has been a big part of my career. And, you know, it has been particularly both granularly on the streets here in New York. And New York City is an incredible city. It has the largest 24/7 subway system, an enormously expansive bus system, and yet there are certainly parts of the city that remain underserved. And at the federal level, I was proud to be part of 2 administrations that started to grapple with this legacy, particularly the Biden administration with the Reconnecting Communities program, forthrightly the first federal program that was ever created explicitly, essentially to address what had been done in the interstate era. But I think want your reflections. We were talking with us. We've made some progress, but it's slow and uneven, I would say.
I just want to jump back to you talking about the highway and people viewing as a wonderful thing. I think so many folks in this country struggle with holding the possibility that two things are true at the same time, right? That the interstate highway was wonderful in how it connected far-flung communities and really drove economic development and opportunity. And it still connects people, particularly in like rural communities, to the economic opportunities in the city. But it doesn't have to be all good. And if we continue only to focus on the good and not acknowledge the bad, we're going to continue to drive inequality. The same is true on, education and New York City subway. Yes, it is great. It's open 24 hours. It connects so many people, but there's still inequalities embedded in that system. And we have to be better at acknowledging the good and the bad, and then trying to, to correct that. You were talking about some of the other systems, and when I do these talks, a lot of people know the highways story, but they don't know the other ways that we have used transportation. So I hope that is a contribution that the book makes, although even with the highways, it was so intentional. And that there's a record of how this was intentional, because we were talking earlier that there was pushback from the Biden administration, where people would say it was, oh, it's just, the highway is just a road, it's not racist. And of course, it is just a road unless it was your community that was targeted and destroyed and removed, right? And made this highways removed hundreds of thousands of vibrant communities, right? We called them slums, and we said that they needed to be torn down so we could, economically develop areas, but they were vibrant, socially and economically vibrant communities that were the hub for so many people. And the highway became this physical and psychological wall. But it just wasn't enough, right? So we used roads in street planning, techniques in the same way. We have major roads that divide communities and destroy communities the way that highways did. But we also used street planning techniques to make it as difficult as possible to get from a Black community to a white community. So things like one-way roads or cul-de-sacs, dead-ending roads were all co-opted in the name of segregation. Atlanta is like the poster child for this. They stay doing the most in everything, in every way of life. The same was true in transportation. They have horrible traffic, and recent studies have shown that part of the reason they have horrible traffic is there's so many one-way streets that all go in the same direction. And that was because they wanted to make it difficult to get from a Black community to a white community, so all the streets led away from the white community. Atlanta would change the names of streets to spare white people the indignity of living on the same street as Black folks. So where there was a through street, it would change as it moved from a Black community to a white community. The name would change. And that, of course, also signals the racial character, and there are all kinds of, fallout from understanding who lives in a neighborhood. We all know that certain images pop up when we talk about Martin Luther King Boulevard or Malcolm X Boulevard. And it's not positive, right? It's not the beloved community that Dr. King dreamed about and spoke of. Atlanta also would build walls in the middle of the street. One of the examples I talk about is something that became known as Atlanta's Berlin Wall. And after a Black surgeon from Morehouse College graduated, lived in a Black community, bought a house at the other end of the street in a white community, the white community went to the mayor and said, this can't happen anymore, you've got to protect us from Black migration. So Atlanta built a wall in the middle of the street. And Atlanta was cheap, so they built it out of wood. People protested and eventually burned the wall down. But then Atlanta rebuilt it, and it was guarded 24 hours a day by the KKK in full regalia, holding signs that said white people have rights too. And that wall stood until members of the Black community sued to take it down. And we still have some of the remnants today, right? Streets that don't connect. Atlanta has one, Willis Mills Road, where there's just a big patch in the middle that's all grass, and people can't understand why there are two sections of Willis Mills Road, because they wanted to make it difficult to get from the white community at one end and the Black community at the other end. They didn't want people to be able to connect. We have in Memphis a street where a wall was built to prevent Black people from driving into the white community. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, You know, it's not about race, why they built this wall right at the dividing line between the black and white communities. It's about where you live, and the folks of this other side of the community just didn't want the traffic coming through, and it's not bad for black folks. You can still get to where you want to go. You just have to drive around and add 10 minutes, just an inconvenience. Luckily, Thurgood Marshall was on the court, and he said, because representation matters, and he had a dissenting opinion and said it's not about inconvenience. It's about the way that government is co-opted to send a message to the black community about their value and to the white community about their value. It's about stamping one community with a badge of inferiority. And around the country, there are walls and cul-de-sacs and signage that are still driving segregation and inequality.
And I would say, and I think this has been a theme in American politics of late, so much of our history we don't fully understand. And in transportation, I would say, again, and I think over the years, I'm one of those youngsters in college who read The Power Broker, and it completely changed my worldview, again, particularly because I grew up 10 minutes away.
I'm glad you read it, because most people in New York just have it on their bedside table for sure, right?
I'm gonna brag, I read it twice, because I reread it when I became the transportation commissioner here, because I inherited some of Robert Moses' handiwork, and Robert Caro, the famous author of that book, did once say about Robert Moses, and Robert Caro was a widely traveled and you know, dogged researcher, and said Robert Moses was the most racist man I ever met. So it's not only the kind of iconic Moses highways like the Cross Bronx and the BQE, he went to Queens Boulevard and made it into what became in New York known as the Boulevard of Death, because it was a residential neighborhood. He turned it in places into a 12-lane, you know, surface highway. So,
but most people don't know the full story, right?
Absolutely not.
We resist understanding our history, so we know the general conversation on Robert Moses, and we think we know all there is to know, but we don't know the way that those things really impacted communities and continue to impact communities. And, you know, we're in Black History Month at the tail end. It's actually the 100th anniversary of Harvey Woodson launching Negro History Week, and we're seeing still resistance to understanding how we got to where we are. We are often in this battle of ideas. You know, think about the context of public transportation or education. If you think about education, either you believe some of the worst stereotypes about Black and brown people, that we don't care for our children, that we don't value education, that we don't care about economic opportunity, or you believe that our system is deeply broken and is driving this inequality and putting Black and brown kids on a path to prison rather than a path to college. And whether you believe the first story or the second story, it depends on your understanding of history and your understanding of all the policies and the ways that we have used to create an opportunity. So there are people who want us to not know this history so that we don't fight for the change that we deserve, that we don't fight for the change that's necessary because you believe these truncated false narratives about how we got to being who we are.
So I want to share one other little historical anecdote myself, and then I want to turn to some of the, I think, the positive advocacy that's happening on the ground. Because I think one thing you talk about powerfully is while these things are happening, communities were fighting back. I mean, there was this was not just passively happening, but just another piece of history. I think, you know, speaking of another thing, maybe a lot of us didn't learn in American history until much later, was the massacre that happened in the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Very famous and tragic incident of what was then known as Black Wall Street white attack, and the entire neighborhood burned down, and historical records murky, but arguably hundreds of people murdered in the process. And this was back in 1921, I think. And, you know, what's often, and so I think now we've sort of learned about that history, but what's often the next part of the history which is not told is actually that community to some degree was rebuilt and started to thrive again. And then a few decades later, boom, interstate run right through the middle of it and basically flattened it again. I had the chance as deputy secretary to spend some time in that community and to actually work with them and get them a Reconnecting Communities grant to try and decide how to repair the damage. Just to speak to some of the complexities of the process, you had local community leaders on the ground who themselves weren't all entirely aligned on what to do. The state, Oklahoma State DOT, had their own views. They invested a lot of money in the highway. They didn't particularly see the benefits in tearing it down. So just these legacies, the histories are complicated, and then the work to restore and repair is complicated too. But you do highlight, and I got to work in some of my roles with some amazing communities and advocates who are thinking of creative ways to bring people together and try and tackle those legacies. And talk about some of those, on a positive note, talk about some of those amazing folks you got to work
I think
with.
there are success stories, and that depends on how you define success. There are some communities that have accepted that the highways in their community and are holding markets underneath that, have turned them into art installations. There are some communities that have been successful in tearing down highways, communities that are getting what they need, and we should use those as models. One of the folks I talk about in the book is Indianapolis, and I think that's a really good example of how we can fight and win, and what that looks like. So Indianapolis, in downtown, they have two major highways, I-65 and I-70, massive highways that intersect right downtown. And their link to segregation was something that you all know called redlining, right? Literally drawing circles around communities and saying, you don't get any economic investment. You're not going to get a loan for your house. You're not going to get a loan to repair your home. And the result of this economic disinvestment and deprivation is the destruction of the fabric of that community. And then we say, well, that community's a little run down. We're going to, inflict further harm. In Indianapolis, they decided to build I-65 and I-70 through redline communities. If you overlay the redlining map with I-65 and I-70, it lines up, the highway just goes through redline communities. And they say, well, that's where the land was the cheapest. But don't ask why was it the cheapest, right? And so I-65 and I-70, like other highways, needed to be rebuilt, and they were going to expand it. They went to the community and said, here are the plans. And the community looked at the plans, and they were like, okay, it looks like what all the highways look like. That's what happens. We need to get around, so I guess you need to expand, and some people are going to lose their homes, but that happens. Because of gentrification, they had some public planners who lived in their community, architect, and they said, well, we're going to build new plans for you so you can see visually the real impact to our community. And when the community saw the more visual plans that spoke to them, they were like, hell no, we're going to fight back. And they decided that they were going to resist. And people continue to donate services to this community to aid in their resistance, help them develop alternative plans. They had alternative air pollution studies, alternative noise studies, cost analysis, and giving the community the tools they needed to fight a fair fight with the Department of Transportation. They were successful, and the project was transformed. Not just this project, but the way that the Indiana Department of Transportation engages around transportation has been transformed because they understand things differently. Dealing with another community in California, where there was a major road that went through their community in Watts. Lots of community members were dying on this road because cars raced down them, just at high speed. Studies show that white drivers don't slow down for black and brown pedestrians, as an aside. And here, everybody driving down the road was racing down it. So they wanted a safer road, but they didn't want a traffic light. They didn't want stop signs. They didn't want more police in their communities, right? Because they didn't want to invite more punishment onto the community that was looking for help, looking for safer streets. And they got assistance from professionals who helped them show that people slow down if you plant trees. People slow down if there are plants along the road. If there are seats along the road, people will slow down. If there is art installations, people will slow down. And so they were able to convince transportation officials to invest in their community in that way. And the road is safer. And as an aside, this community used to have trees along this road in their community, and why don't they have them now? Because LAPD requested that they be cut down because they were interfering with surveillance by helicopter, right? And that history is important to understand about how the community got there. But my point is that the community understands what they need. They understand what is, possible for them and best for them. What they need are the tools to fight a fair fight. The tools to speak the language of planning professionals in the Department of Transportation, tools to help other people see what they've imagined for their community. And if we engage in ways that empower the community with all the tools that they need to fight, we can see something different. If we don't impose on them what we feel are the solutions, but engage with them in a meaningful way, not just to check a box, but to really engage and give some power to the community to decide collectively their future.
So I want to make sure we get some time for questions. We have a lot of our students here, and I know they have things they want to talk to you about. We also have someone here I know is a longstanding champion on transportation accessibility activists. And I think there's one story, Deborah, in particular, that I think is important to share, the story of the bus stop. The challenge to get the one bus stop built in that community.
Yeah.
Because it's, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so it's in the chapter on public transportation, and of course, you know that public transportation started out guided by intentional discrimination, but then evolved under this kind of cloud of dog whistles that leans into this narrative of excessive Black criminality. The result is transportation deserts in Black and brown communities because of lack of investment, but also in white communities to keep out the Black and brown people who use public transportation. And one of the kind of primary targets are buses. And we see around the country white communities trying to keep out buses. I can tell the story of a woman named Cynthia in Rochester, New York. Cynthia worked in an upscale mall, but the mall wouldn't let the city bus into the parking lot. They let commuter buses into the parking lot. They let tour buses into the parking lot, but not the city bus. And so folks who ride in the city bus had to race across 7 lanes of traffic to get into the parking lot for the mall. And one day as she was making that run across those lanes of traffic to get to work, she was struck by a dump truck and killed. It is the most tragic end to a story that repeats around the country. In Beaver Creek, Ohio, this was in 2010, they not only wouldn't let the bus stop in the parking lot of their upscale mall, they didn't have any bus stops in Beaver Creek. So Beaver Creek is a suburb of Dayton, Ohio. Folks who wanted to come from Dayton and get to Beaver Creek to work at the mall, to shop at this mall, had to take the bus to the last stop and then walk the 2 miles to the mall. Half of that was over a highway overpass that didn't have any traffic calming measures, had no sidewalks, no crosswalks, and people had to take that walk at night, in the rain, in the snow, in the wind, in the cold. And community got together and they got the Regional Transportation Authority to go to Beaver Creek and say, you need to put some bus stops in Beaver Creek. And Beaver Creek said, no, we're not gonna do that. We don't represent those people in Dayton, we represent the people in Beaver Creek, and they don't want those people here. They said that we don't want our mall turning into the Dayton Mall, which was the mall where Black and brown folks shop. So they said, it's not gonna happen. One woman, a resident of Beaver Creek, a white woman, stood at a city council meeting and said, why is it okay that these people come out, by Chris, come out and, and serve us and work in our stores and make sure that our lives are safe, but we won't provide them a safe way to get to work. Beaver Creek still said it's not gonna happen. The federal government then came in and to help that fight and pushed Beaver Creek. Beaver Creek said, fine, we'll add a bus stop under a few conditions. One, we'll need to have rules of conduct posted in all the bus stops. You all know what's gonna happen with those rules of conduct. They're gonna be the basis of harassment for the people who will be at those bus stops. They said there needed to be 24-hour live surveillance cameras from the bus stops that fed into the police station. No other bus stops in the regional system had that kind of 24-hour live surveillance. And then Beaver Creek said that all bus stops needed to be fully air-conditioned and fully heated. And at that point, the only fully air-conditioned bus shelter in the world was in Dubai. Right? And so we all know it wasn't about the comfort of people riding the bus. It wasn't about making sure that rules of conduct were obeyed. It was about racism, about keeping Black and brown folks out. And we see that over and over again. The story I tell in this book, you mentioned disability and access. The story I tell is about race. There are so, in particularly Black communities, but there are so many stories about inequality embedded in our transportation system. There are stories about gender inequality and disability access, and the ways that they intersect. In the chapter on sidewalks, I talk about the way that sidewalks have a deep history of racial inequality used to kind of shore up racial hierarchies. But one of the results is that in Black and brown communities, there aren't usable sidewalks, right? They'll be all broken up. People can't navigate them, or there'll be one little piece of sidewalk and then a mile with no sidewalk, and then another little piece of sidewalk. Makes it very difficult for people to navigate their own communities safely. And one of the stories I tell is about a man in Louisiana who used a wheelchair, but his community had broken up sidewalks that he could not safely navigate the sidewalks using his wheelchair, so he had to use the street. And the police stopped him, arrested him for walking in the street because he was using his wheelchair to get around in the street, with great consequences to him. Another story of a woman walking in the street because her community in Louisiana didn't have usable sidewalks, assaulted by the police and severely injured. I remind people of the story of Michael Brown. Michael Brown was in Ferguson, a community notorious for having broken and unusable sidewalks. Community advocates had been advocating for decades to have better sidewalks. But rather than invest with the resources that the community has been deprived, we invest with policing. And so Michael Brown was stopped that day for walking in the street with a friend, and that resulted in him losing his life. And so, yes, it is a story about racial inequality. It's also a story about disability access, because people need to be able to navigate their communities safely, to be able to get to work and home, and to see friends and family.
So thank you. So again, I know we have a lot of students here, and I want to take some questions. One thing I don't know, is someone helping us with the mic? Here we go. Okay. Who would like to ask a question? All right, hang on. I'm going to right over here. And identify yourself. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Dean Trottenberg, and hi, Deborah. My name is Claire Chan. I'm a Wagner student studying urban planning. I'm from Atlanta, so to hear more about the historical context of the the transportation system that exists today in Atlanta was really informative. It's a story that I've heard over and over, but I think you share a lot of things that I didn't know about, so I'm excited to read more in your book. But I wanted to know if you have any thoughts on what you make of some of the investments, like the Stitch project and things that are going on in Atlanta, and what you make of whether you think those are going to help redress some of the the economic and social impacts of those transportation.
I was excited to see some of the things that are going on, kind of some of the things that Polly was talking about in the beginning. I think the Biden administration was doing. First of all, I just appreciate the conversation and the way that the conversation had shifted during the administration at the federal level, the state level, the local level, talking honestly and openly about the history and how we got it. That alone was an improvement, to have real, honest conversations about what was happening. I appreciate the economic investment that we're seeing and the effort to be more equitable in transportation. I think where I think some of these projects could go further. It's one thing to say that racial justice is the goal. There's another thing to embed in the processes and the planning and the conditions, kind of showing that you are working towards racial justice. Because it's fine to say, think about racial equity as you're doing this, but we have to think about ways to enforce that, right? To not just make it be kind of rhetorical flourish that we have, but meaningful accountability around fighting for racial justice. I think all the investment is incredibly important. But as we were talking about, there are lots of threats that come with the economic investment and economic revitalization. And so we have to think in the long term. It is not about a short-term investment in these communities, because we'll see over the long term that the people who have been living in the shadow of these highways, who have been living with deprivation and still building vibrant, communities of sustainability, will be displaced when we have the economic investment. The mom and pop stores will be displaced. People who have been living there and renting there will no longer be able to afford to rent or to pay the taxes, and will be displaced. So we have to think even longer term. It's not about short-term economic investment. It's about the long-term economic investment and other investments in the stability of that community, not just the economic revitalization, but the ability of people who have lived there to continue to live there. I think we think that this is easy, and as I say in the book, it's not easy to put Humpty Dumpty back together again It's in 1,000 pieces. And we have to think about all the pieces and figure out how to put all of them back together. Again, not just the physical divide that we see, not just the physical impact that a highway had or other transportation infrastructure had, but all the ways that it tore at the community physically, economically, socially, in the short term, and then thinking about the long term. Okay. Where's our mic? There's two in the front.
Oh, okay, yes, thanks.
Hello, my name is Benji. I am a urban planning student here at Wagner. I also work in transit advocacy. And in transit advocacy in New York City, there's a lot of conversation about policing on public transit in New York City. A lot of people will say they feel safer around cops in public transit, and that is often what the MTA cites when they call for more police on public transit. But there are a lot of people also that feel significantly less safe when there are more cops on public transit. Where does this conversation go? How do we bring in the history of policing into the conversation around safety on public transit?
I think we do just that. We bring in the right. We have to complicate the story and explain why historically people may not feel safer with more police, but also the current implications. There's a discussion in the book about the way that we police public transportation differently around the country and the disproportionate impact that it has on Black and brown folks, even on an integrated public transportation system. There are repercussions to bringing more police into the system. We also have to, I think, take a step back and think about safety. I want to be in a community that's safe as well, and I want us to do it in the way that these suburban communities are safe, right? They are safe not because they order their lives in ways that invite the police into their community, right? You could go to many suburban communities. I used to live in New Rochelle for a minute, and you can go days and not encounter any police officer at all. And those communities are safe because they invest in ways that make the community safe. They invest in their children, they invest in their health, they invest in each other, in creating economic opportunities in ways that create safety without over-reliance on police. And I think we have to think about how we can make public transportation safe, how we can make our community safe in all the ways, and not have this knee-jerk reaction that the only way to make people safe is by bringing in more police.
My name is Pan Hong, and I'm originally from South Korea. And I cannot help but thinking about this show that was on Netflix. It's called Extraordinary Attorney Woo. And one of the episodes there were, South Korea is very homogenous state. So it is very, it's very refreshing to kind of look into your perspective on race and communities in the United States. The episode in the Extraordinary Attorney Woo, there is a conflict between these two communities, two towns, because the government was trying to build a highway. So they either build a highway that's linear and pass through one town, or because of the dispute, the government had to build a highway like a little bit skewed or rounded. So, and I'm from New Jersey, Bergen County, and Englewood Cliffs, and Englewood is one example of a very affluent town versus there's an uptown and downtown. But because of the light rail that's being built through Bergen County, the downtown even is getting a lot of private fund and it's being developed. I remember the town from 20, 30 years ago that was clearly sort of divided, I would say, but now entire town is being developed all together. And so I guess my point is that sometimes, aside from the racial perspective, sometimes it's just funding and private interest that kind of helps the communities to kind of, be developed all together, which is really for the public good of all. So, in the example of New Jersey, we have light rails coming in, and it's actually building up and raising the real estate values of homes, and people want to live where the light rails are coming in because it's so convenient to New York City. And, in terms of highways, I don't know, as many people have traveled across the world, and we have seen countries where the highways are not necessarily ugly, but it's beautiful. They have very nice highways. So highway in some countries, it's not so bad. So I think it's a matter of beautification of our roads in the United States. How we make it beautiful, how we improve our, visibility. So I think we could add that sort of topic into our conversations as well. That would really help everyone better,
And I definitely want to make, focus on beautifying all of our transportation, make everyone better. I think the challenge for me is that there's so many communities that are so far behind that we first have to bring them up to a certain level before we can make everyone, move forward into the next century together. And yes, there are, white communities that have transportation infrastructure. They get private investment, but there's still a racial story. New Jersey is one of the most segregated states in the country, residentially, and deeply, profoundly segregated. And you can see that in economic investment in transportation infrastructure all throughout New Jersey. And I have no doubt that in some of the more affluent communities that things were done differently. We talked about the BQE when we were chit-chatting before. And I don't know nearly as much about BQE as Polly does, but
Nobody knows as much as I do, actually.
one
Turns out.
that I understand, at least from seeing it myself, is that the pieces of the BQE that go through, the Fort Wayne Black communities, like typical ugly highway, elevated highway that makes everything underneath it, dark and unsafe and, cuts you off from the rest of the community and from the water. But in Brooklyn Heights, they went through great trouble to make that pretty, to embed that into the wall and build that park on top of it, because that community was a white affluent community that could say, we're not gonna let you do that to us. And so yes, they have transportation, people can say that the BQE goes through a white community too, but not in the way that it went through the Black, Latino, and other communities of color. It is different and feels different, and again, that is part of the story.
And I'll just add, sort of speaking about that international perspective, to me there is a great difference between the highways running across the vast expanse of America and the highways that clear cut their way through American cities. And, you can go to a lot of European cities where they didn't do that. They built a ring road. And look, the ring roads did some damage too, and not every part of Europe is idealistic, but they were much more careful and thoughtful about how they built roads through, their historical cities. And I do think obviously race played a big role in how things turned out in our country. But I do think, just to get to the design question, we also became a country that became strangely fixated on just incredibly over-engineered roadways built for maximum speed for cars. Sometimes there was a racial animus behind it, but there was also an engineering imperative that in many ways made roads that could have been more meandering and more attractive just sort of brutalist highways. So there's a lot of complexity to what we did here, and you can look at other parts of the world where they chose a very different course.
So I'm Yoshi again. My question.
Yoshi, you're making me nervous because he wrote his question down. He's like, so it's gonna really be a 20-part question.
No. Within the context of the history of race in America that you talk about, that I think affects both transportation and housing, how do you take proactive action to repair those harms without the policy just being to prevent more harm from happening? Because I think I mentioned like the Cross Bronx, and a lot of the recent advocacy has been to stop like a further expansion, but there aren't like calls to, I mean, there are calls, but there isn't like legitimate pressure to tear it down or to even bury it. And I think like that jump we haven't gotten there yet, where like we're still trying to figure out how to prevent bad from happening, at least that's my view of what's happening in New York. But I guess for both of you, like where do we have to get to have enough pressure to actually like fix and not just prevent further harm.
Well, that's a story that's happening in other states around the country. There are examples of highways being embedded or kind of being built over and putting parks and things on them, right? There's stories about highways being torn down and turned into a street grid. That was a plan for I-81 in Syracuse, was to take down that piece of the highway and make it a street grid. So it is possible, and it is happening in places other than New York City. And again, I think I want to make sure that we don't overly focus on the highways, because that impacts one group of folks, right? But there's so much more on transportation infrastructure that we need to be thinking about. One of the challenges I have around civil rights laws generally are that it is something that we wield to address harm. That it is after you have injured me, after you have denied me access to a house, after you have fired me from my job, after you have destroyed my community with this highway, then I'm going to take civil rights law and try to get the most redress that I can from my community. But there's another way to think about civil rights law. You know, there's another avenue that is about construction. It is about building communities that feed justice. It is about building what we need. And so we need to think more affirmatively about how we use not only civil rights laws, but other laws to force government to give us what we need to think differently about how we treat, support, and build communities of color and other marginalized communities. So I think in transportation infrastructure, we need to be thinking more affirmatively about how to build a system that serves everyone, so that not one community is bearing all of the harms and not accessing the benefits. But that, I think, is true about civil rights across the board, that we are not thinking enough about, you know, Dr. King said, as I mentioned, the beloved community. It was not about fighting the harms that were being imposed on the community. It was about building together this community that allowed everyone to thrive. And so I think that pivot in how we engage. And then I would just say, what you do is engage all the time, right? Not wait until everyone has been talking about the BQE and then engage. It is every single planning meeting. Are they, you know, they're thinking about bus stops. Go to that meeting. Why are there not bus stops here? Why is this the bus route? Why are we only considering these 3 routes for this road? Why are we not you know, building bike lanes in this community and investing in the same way? Asking questions. We don't have to have the answers. 90% of the time I don't have an answer. But I will certainly ask the questions and force you to have an answer. And that's what I think we need to do every single day.
So I want to add just a little bit of history, again, history to that question, because it gets to the challenges, and as some of you know, very involved in the challenges looking at the BQE, and just I think Deborah mentioned it. Just to go back in history to when the Interstate Highway Act was passed, at that time the federal government was reimbursing states at 90 cents on the dollar. Transit dollars were meager, I think would be a generous way to describe it. So there's even a deeper set of choices that were embedded in the way we invested at the federal level in transportation for decades. And one of the challenges of a big highway like the Cross Bronx would be, in addition to the volumes of traffic and all the other complexities, if you think about it, and I've tried to look at some of the estimates, let's just say it this way, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars were put into building this massive infrastructure. And it takes a lot of resources in some cases to repair that, like to deck over the crosswalks, which people have been talking about it since certainly before Robert Carroll was spoke, but certainly afterwards. It is a daunting and complex project with a huge price tag. Some of these projects around the country you can do in a more affordable way, and I again was proud to be part of at least the start of some of those federal dollars to help. But some of them, just the scale of what needs to be done requires dollars that often just at the city or even the state level are just very hard to come by. So a challenge for the next generation. I think we have time for one more question.
Yay, my question. Is this on?
No.
No. Okay. Hi. You said something about like staying consistent with just transportation and being involved. Like, let's stay on that topic because something has been bothering my mind for years now. So remember COVID, everyone remembers COVID, right? Okay, COVID-19. During that time, let's say 3 years, why didn't the MTA like innovate and use that time away to like fix all these issues? I mean, 2026, I'm waiting 30 minutes for a train or 30 minutes for a bus. I don't understand what's going on. It's a big problem. Other people are frustrated. So that's one question. And the second thing, a lot of people here are asking questions about like safety and which is interesting, obviously, but really like your question about beauty and purifying things. So if we're gonna build and talk about building, we need to be optimistic. And I wonder if you have any optimism in your book, because you're charging it for like, what, 30 bucks? And that's a lot of money nowadays, so I really need to understand. That's it. My name is not important.
I'll take the MTA question. I'll leave the book pricing to the author. Because I was transportation commissioner here and was very involved also with the MTA at that time. And just for those of us who were here in New York at that time, it was terrifying. And a lot of MTA workers lost their lives to COVID. And at first, you all may remember this, I was dealing with this operation in the city because we were the first city to get COVID so heavily. There were so many things we didn't know. We didn't have, I remember as a commissioner begging the then health commissioner, could I get some masks and PPE? And her answer to me was an understandable one, which is we don't have enough and I need to save them for doctors and nurses. That wasn't the answer that my ferry workers wanted to hear, but that's sort of where New York started in COVID, and we learned a lot of lessons and we lost some lives in the process, even including, you may remember, they were putting people on ventilators and then they realized the smarter thing to do was to turn them on their stomachs and save them. So we were unfortunately, I think, learning as we were going. The MTA, you may remember, ridership plummeted on the subways almost to zero. Buses, less so, and it revealed, boy, talk about revealing a stark racial divide. Who were people still relying on public transportation in the absolute heat of the epidemic? So it was a very stark time for the MTA. They were losing workers, they were retooling their operations, the bottom was falling out of their revenue. Now they did, as things started to stabilize, they did take some of that time. Transit systems around the country did this actually, to start doing some of the massive repairs that particularly here in New York are hard to do in a 24/7 system. So to that extent, they, I guess, took some advantage of the drops in ridership to start to do some of that backlog of repair work. It's not sexy, but it did in the end put the system in a better state of repair, and the system adapted over time to better health and safety protocols and to start to rebuild the ridership. But it was, I think, such a difficult time. I think in some ways they were trying to keep the workforce and the traveling public safe, and it didn't bring out all the innovations maybe that would have happened in easier times. So what's your have a follow-up on that?
Just wanted to
Well,
mention.
actually, wait, we have to let Deborah answer this.
Okay.
Okay.
Just wanted to mention that I'm in logistics business, so I kind of keep up with the news, but I believe the New York Metro will be replacing all the subways. I know there's a French company called Alstom, and it's a rolling stock company, and they just want a deal to replace all the subways. So we will have the brand new, like top of the line subways coming soon.
In New York City?
In New York City.
All right, there's, all right, so I think you were being asked for kind of, for Deborah, an optimistic closing.
In 30 seconds,
I think we'd love to hear that.
I can't, you know, if you want to question the price of the book, you'll have to contact Norton. I don't control that, but you can, people who want to read it can certainly go to the public library. I know there are many copies there. NYU's library has copies there as well, or you can wait until July when the paperback comes out. On the issue of optimism, I think it's an optimistic book, and I'm an optimistic person. I think some of that comes from being a civil rights lawyer, where you have to have an endless well of optimism, because we always lose more than we win, but we continue to fight. And I think the story here is a part of the story about resilience and how communities of color have fought back against all that we have imposed on them to get into a point today where so many are fighting for their communities, so many are fighting back. On the issue of beautification, I recently spoke on a panel at the Ford Foundation on monuments. And I fit into that because I think, you know, we talk about monuments as statues and have debates about that, but our communities are monuments to white supremacy. not just the transportation infrastructure that has divided them or they've been deprived of the schools that our communities have or don't have, of the hospitals that our communities have or don't have, of the parks that our communities have or don't have, the beauty and care in our communities or that's not there. And I want beautiful, vibrant communities for people of color as much as anyone else, because I believe that our people deserve that, deserve to wake up every day in beautiful communities to see flowers and green and trees. And that has been deprived in Black and brown communities in so many ways because of discrimination, because we don't value Black and brown lives as much as we value other lives, because we don't value the joy of Black and brown people as much as we value the joy of other people. And so I have spent my life fighting for beauty and vibrance and love and life in Black and brown communities, and will continue to do that. And I think that, you know, if we look at this room, that there's no reason not to be optimistic. We have this room of incredibly diverse people who are living unimaginable lives decades before that we would be doing the things that we were doing, have access to the opportunities that we had, is just unimaginable. And we cannot not be optimistic when we see the progress that we have made, even despite having to have a clear eyes about the challenges that we face and the challenges in front of us and how hard that work will be. We have more powerful tools than the people who fought and led and survived so that we could be in this room. We have more powerful tools than they have. And if they could get us to this point, who are we to say that there's nothing more that we can do to fight to finish the fight that they started? Amen.
Deborah, Professor Archer, I'm calling you Professor because I think you've helped teach us in this book. This book is a history lesson. It's a lesson about contemporary politics. For those of us who are in transportation and urban planning in those fields, it's a reminder to redouble our efforts to understand our history and to be part of building a better future. So thank you so much. We're so honored to have you.